Welcome back to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Iggy Kosny, a scientist from the Institute for Work and Health in Toronto. Welcome back, Iggy.
Thank you.
You were just talking about the study you've just completed around healthcare providers interacting with the Workers' Compensation Board, and I just cut you off when you were talking about where the injury or the situation is a little bit complex. What did you find in those instances?
So I think this is where healthcare providers ran into problems. And I feel like part of the issue is that when they see workers' compensation patients, some of those patients will have very straightforward injuries. And so they may only get a couple of patients a year, especially if they're a general practitioner, where they're complicated. What I mean by complicated is they're gradual onset conditions. They're maybe multiple conditions. Maybe there's a mental health condition on top of the physical injury, things like chronic pain, and so they sort of run into problems when they see patients with those types of conditions, in part because I think the Workers' Compensation Board isn't necessarily well equipped to deal with those kinds of injuries and conditions. And one of the things that we found was that healthcare providers didn't have a clear sense of what their role was in the compensation system and didn't have a clear idea of how the system worked, right? So most of their patients weren't workers' compensation patients. They didn't have to deal with the Workers' Compensation Board. But when they did have to, and if it was a complicated injury, then this was problematic because they weren't quite sure sort of where they fit into the system. And I'll just give you an example, one which kind of has stuck with me, which is around the healthcare providers on their forms are asked when the person is ready to go back to work. They're often asked to provide a date. Yet, except for Quebec, their recommendation is not binding. And we really got a sense that most healthcare providers didn't understand that they didn't fully appreciate that what their recommendation was something that the board would take into consideration, but it wasn't binding like it is maybe in some other jurisdictions, like when, in England or in Australia, where you have to produce a sick note, and the sick note allows a person to go back, or I guess it's called a wellness note, I think, in the UK now. So.
And those were common here in Thunder Bay too. Like if you were off for a while and with doctor's permission, you had to get clearance from the doctor to go back to work.
Yeah, so I think because there's this somewhat unclear understanding, well, where do I fit in as a healthcare provider? What I say to the board, is that what then happens with the patient? Well, we know that sometimes it isn't. And so that creates a bit of tension and sometimes disagreements with the board, which of course means that a kind of collaborative, joint work on helping that person recover and get back to employment doesn't happen because there's this disagreement about, well, who makes the decision and what is done with what I provide you and those types of issues. So that was one of the findings. The other finding, which I thought would be interesting for your audience here in Thunder Bay, was around how kind of those larger macro level factors like availability of doctors and access to doctors might affect a person's ability to go back to work in a timely manner. And we heard a lot from doctors that patients don't have regular family doctors, that they end up seeing going to walk-in clinics, going to emergency rooms, and even for, not for traumatic injuries, but for mental health conditions or for, back pain. And certainly those kinds of doctors, we interviewed a number of doctors who worked in those settings, in emergency rooms, and, they don't feel equipped to deal with somebody who needs assistance returning to work and help with planning that process and putting that in place and really being actively involved in that, because of course they're in the emergency room, they're dealing with different types of injuries. So I thought that was quite interesting as well.
So it's kind of like the way the workers' compensation system is set up prescribes a role for doctors, but they don't really know what it is, and don't necessarily fit well within that structure that.
Yeah. Well, you know, what I found very interesting is we looked at all the workers' compensation boards across Canada at their websites, and specifically on the healthcare providers section of the website, because we wanted to know, well, what are healthcare providers told their role is? And, you know, I would encourage you and the audience to go and check that out, because I found it so surprising how little information there is about what is, you know, I was sort of expecting to hear, well, your role is specifically this, and this is what you should be doing, and this is where you fit into the system. But often it was very vague. The language was vague, and you know, so you would read things like, well, part of your role is to support return to work. What does that mean exactly? What does support return to work mean? Does that mean I contact the employer? If so, who do I contact? Does that mean am I doing return to work planning? Am I responsible for, like, what is my responsibility beyond treatment? So I think there is a really, you know, I don't know. I don't know if it's because that the boards don't have a clear sense of what exactly the role should be. I don't know if maybe there's never been a discussion between the board and healthcare providers around what that role should be. But certainly, I mean, that was a major finding, that there was a little clarity about what exactly the role should be.
And in between the two studies we talked about, you were over in Australia for a couple of years.
I was, yeah.
Looking kind of at the same situation, but in Australia.
Yeah.
What were some of the highlights from your work over there?
Well, I think, you know, it's interesting because in Australia, unlike in Canada, you can launch you can go to court. You can take your employer to court if you have a certain type of injury. So it has to be a severe injury. And one of the things I found interesting was that, you know, when a system is very litigious, it does create sort of additional problems. Like I think anytime you have a system which becomes adversarial and there are parties that are, you know, pitted against each other in some way, that ultimately, you know, certainly my opinion, is not good for injured workers. That you know, creates a lot of conflict and can create stress. So one of the things that I think we see in Australia is that a lot of independent medical exams, right? So workers being sent for exams because their lawyer sends them for exam, the board wants another exam, and so, and those sorts of things are very stressful for injured workers, and you know, certainly injured workers with mental health conditions, which are accepted in many of the states in Australia. Those workers are often being sent to independent medical examiners, and you could imagine how kind of stressful and difficult that must be to have to go through that over and over again and kind of tell your story and to say what happened and feel like you're being judged. So,
Iggy, we're out of time. Oh my gosh. If people want to find out more, how can they do that?
Well, they can go to the Institute for Work and Health website, and there's a link to my profile, and they can link to my name, and a bunch of the research studies I've been involved in.
We'll put that on the screen. Thank you very much, and come back again next week.